Thank you very much indeed. It is very nice to be here again, and I thank Dr. Latif for accepting my suggestion to have it less formal than black tie dinner. I believe there are enough black dinner events in New York, and maybe this more relaxed atmosphere is more conducive to open and frank discussion. I believe that those who are here in this room care a lot about the future of your own country and about our bilateral relations. So I would like to be open, frank, and try to then entertain your questions and your remarks. And of course, I lived in New York, all in all, for 17 years, and I traveled a bit in this country, so it is also not the place which is absolutely irrelevant to my life and to my perception of the international relations. This year we celebrate 200th anniversary of diplomatic relations between the United States and Russia. Many important things happened over this period. We remember the time when Russia supported the North American colony struggle for independence, when Russia pursued the policy of armed neutrality, which allowed this new country to trade and consequently to survive in the struggle. We can remember enlightened contacts between Alexander I and Thomas Jefferson. We can also remember the time when both Russia and the United States were exploring the new lands in the American West, and that the 49th state of the United States once used to be the Russian territory. We, of course, would remember the meeting on the Elbe River, the Lend-Lease assistance, which was very important, the first Soyuz Apollo space mission, many things which indeed brought our countries and people together. At the same time, we have seen not so good times, confrontation, evolving into the Cold War, the Caribbean crisis, which, by the way, showed that the leaders of the two countries, even at that time, did have the wisdom to avoid the standoff. And then this logically brought the policy of detente, which, in spite of the confrontational standoff of the two blocs, was the realization that we cannot indeed survive if we don't talk to each other and if we don't build bridges. And what's most important is that our common history has known more ups than downs, and that whatever turn our relations took, they always highlighted the great future for both the US and Russia, which was foreseen by Alexis de Tocqueville. Russia underwent transformations in the 1990s, which removed the grounds for ideological incompatibility and confrontation in Russian-American relations. It opened up new and unprecedented prospects for our cooperation. The experience of working together over the past few years demonstrates that, given political will, mutual respect, and equal treatment, we can fully realize the potential of our cooperation. And the presidencies of Vladimir Putin and George W. Bush, their mutual personal commitment, chemistry if you like, and commitment to developing partnership, opened a new page in our history, in our relations. The uncertainty of the 1990s was left behind. While overcoming the vestiges of its past, Russia had to make some very hard decisions, which became a kind of investment in our common future. Russia's response to the 9/11 terrorist attacks gave strong political momentum to our relations, adding to them an emotional dimension and prompting recollections of our alliance during World War II. The fight against terror the joint efforts to topple the Taliban regime in Afghanistan, because Russia did help, including with the provision of military transit through its territory and helping to get permission for such transit through the territory of its allies in Central Asia. All this served as a very powerful uniting factor. And parallel to this, there was progress in trade and economic relations, including the energy sector, even in spite of the well-known differences over Iraq. These differences couldn't stall this process. At the same time, as Russia was regaining its strength, it was faced with increasing pressure from outside to ensure free access to Russian oil and gas resources and to influence its internal political development. I want to be very clear. I don't support the claims that there was a deliberate strategy vis-à-vis Russia, but we are all very well aware that in politics the perception of reality sometimes matters more than reality itself. Moreover, a new trend in our relations emerged against the background of other important developments, including in the very sensitive area of strategic stability, when the US unilaterally started a revision of our common achievements in the field of disarmament and arms control. The US withdrew from the ABM Treaty, and the future of another important instrument, the START Treaty, was put into question under the American political parlance. It was called the Cold War legacy. And regrettably, we now have to think how to prevent growing alienation between us. And I'd like to stress this point. Not a new confrontation for which there are no objective reasons, but rather mutual aloofness. We will not succeed unless we reach a common perception of the world we live in, of the shape of things to come. After the end of the Cold War, Russia could not afford the luxury of self-delusions. We couldn't be mistaken as regards the new reality and just had to accept it, however difficult the psychological adaptation was. We gave up the ideology and chose pragmatism and common sense, building our foreign policy on sound national interests. And I do believe that we found ourselves in the mainstream of international life. At that very period, at the end of the Cold War, the United States found itself in a different position. It had more options than we did. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, the situation allowed the United States to choose how to act in international relations. Unfortunately, it took 15 years to begin to realize that the end of the Cold War had radically changed the world for all countries without exception. Moreover, I would venture to say that the former perception of the American leadership started to give way even among the Western community. In geopolitical terms of the past, the end of the bipolar world and the dramatic change of the international landscape looked very much like a geopolitical catastrophe for the United States as well. You remember when Putin said that the collapse of the Soviet Union was the biggest geopolitial catastrophe of the 20th century. He was hugely criticized as dreaming of the times of the Soviet Union, armed with all those nukes. He meant a very different thing. He meant that we all lost our country. It was our country. And I believe that people can understand this. Well, God forbid you from living through the same situation, but this was what he meant. When I say that this was true for many other countries, including the United States, I mean that the US certainly has found itself alone, and the temptation to do many things at the same time was huge, and not all of this works as was intended to. So I believe the problems are mutual. The problems which were caused by the end of the Cold War, the way it did end, are common problems of the world, though in different countries they present themselves differently. We are convinced that today it is the national interests which should be cleared of all artificial ideological motives, should become the reference point of the international process. Quite some time ago, the European countries arrived at such a conclusion, having experienced the bloodshed of religious wars on the continent. The Cold War was a rollback when national interests were sacrificed for the sake of ideology. In this sense, I wonder whether restoration of the Westphalian system of coordinates in modern international relations could be helpful to overcome the legacy of the era of ideological confrontation, so that each country could again firmly rely on its vital and pragmatic interests while respecting similar interests of others. Today, global challenges are coming to the forefront, and nobody can counter them alone efficiently. Since we have to deal more and more with phenomena rather than with threats from individual states, the significance and efficiency, I would add, of military power in international relations is objectively decreasing. Globalization has gone beyond the boundaries of the Western civilization, which can also be attributed to the end of the Cold War. And today competition assumes a civilizational dimension and a genuinely global character. The current situation is absolutely different from that which prevailed during the Cold War, when competition took place within the framework of one civilization between antagonists armed with different products of European political thought. So we can understand globalization fears, as German Foreign Minister Frank-Walter Steinmeier put it. But one shouldn't respond to the new environment irrationally. Brent Scowcroft justly notes that it is counterproductive to, I quote, to divide the world up again between the good and the evil, end of quote. And one more quote from Brent Scowcroft: increasingly, power in the broad sense resides more in the collectivity of states, end of quote. Well, for that reason, I believe nothing short of destructive seems any attempt to address the challenges of a new global situation in the old ideological manner, namely through devising artificial confrontational constructions where the paradigm of modern international relations is forced into the narrow formula of liberal democracy against authoritarian capitalism. And the latter allegedly represented by Russia and China, with Russia being put at the spearhead of this newly invented confrontation designed to divide the world once again into friends and foes. Like one police officer in a famous movie said, rounding up usual suspects. I remember a story by some Roman historian of a well-born young man who asked an influential politician for advice, and the politician concluded that the problems were so serious that they did not lend themselves to a solution without a civil war. I would hate to think that anyone is seeking solutions to its own problems through destruction of the existing international legal order, through an atmosphere of confrontation and division of the world along ideological and civilizational lines. History shows that it is precisely bipolar structures that inevitably led to confrontation. A similar situation prevailed on the eve of World War I and during the Cold War. Anti-Americanism, in fact, produces the same outcome. I would like to assure you that Russia will never let anyone make it a part of such confrontational schemes. Let me quote an independent Russian researcher, Fyodor Lukyanov. He is editor-in-chief of the Russian Global Affairs magazine, which is the partner of Foreign Affairs magazine here. In his recent article, he gives the following analysis of the parallels between those attempts and the ideological and political origins of the Cold War. So I quote, "Conflict was a condition more easily understood and in many ways more expedient than a difficult search for a balance of interest and areas of agreement. Today, we can see the same mechanisms at work in the genesis of a Cold War with our own eyes. The absurdity of the situation is that there is no clash of ideologies, no arms race, and not even irresolvable geopolitical conflicts between Russia and the United States. End of quote. So what are the differences that put us apart on the practical issues of international affairs? I would like to dwell on the most relevant ones. As far as Iran is concerned, we are unanimous that breaches of the non-proliferation regime are inadmissible. But we differ on how to reach this goal. Each side has its own analysis. We proceed from the assumption that the problem of Iran's nuclear program, like any other international problem, cannot be resolved by force. This means that there is no alternative to a political and diplomatic settlement. Iran is undergoing a real political process which can be positively influenced only through its engagement. And we should have learned a good lesson from the faulty Versailles system. It has demonstrated how dangerous it is to artificially create rogue states and refuse to provide equal security for all. We can hardly prevent any mistaken steps if someone is determined to take them. But we will feel sorry if our partners make a hasty choice, be it a military solution for Iran or unilateral independence for Kosovo. The real question is whether the United States, Europe, the Middle East, and the entire international community can afford it. It is quite telling that the appeals to build up pressure on Iran, while leaving all options on the table, are voiced precisely at the moment when the International Atomic Energy Agency obtained Tehran's pledges and commitments to close the important issues related to its nuclear program. Let's not forget that a similar situation existed in 2003 vis-à-vis Iraq, when the IAEA was not given a chance to complete the work it had begun, and the so-called coalition of the willing, in circumvention of the UN Security Council, undertook to accomplish the mission. By the way, coalitions of the willing do not constitute multilateralism. Simply some countries subscribe to decisions already taken by somebody else, and as Fyodor Dostoevsky put it in one of his novels, they are, quote, longing for submission to somebody else's will, end of quote. I think that true multilateralism is not in the numbers of the participants, but rather in the modalities of interaction. It implies joint analysis from the very beginning, joint decision-making, and as a consequence, shared responsibility. If this approach had been applied in respect to, say, Iraq, I think the results could have been different. As for Iran, at the very beginning, when we started working in this format of the 6 countries, it seemed that we agreed to work on a collective basis within 6-party format and within the Security Council, meaning 6 countries, 3 European countries, US, Russia, and China. However, in addition to our mutually developed measures, which have been endorsed by the Security Council and which begin to bring results, as I mentioned, in addition to this, the US and some European countries are announcing unilateral and obviously disproportionate sanctions against Iran. This absolutely damages the common course. One more example. As to our relations with the European Union, these relations suffer from what I would call collective unilateralism. The EU members seem to be mesmerized by their numbers, and each of them may demand solidarity of everybody on any of its own problem. And as a result, we encounter a bloc position. And we find this bloc position not only when we negotiate directly with the EU, but when we negotiate in the United Nations, when we negotiate in the Council of Europe, in OSCE, anywhere. And of course, I accept that in terms of their rights to do this, they have this right. But they should certainly remember that in terms of pluralistic democracy, the EU, in its external context, should seek a broader consensus than the one existing within their own majority. Otherwise, we will be dealing with a situation resembling, if you remember, the democratic centralism of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, when minority was always required to follow the majority. Russia is by no means interested in the United States retiring into its shell and minding its own business internationally, as called for by a considerable part of the US public opinion. But Russia cannot cooperate on terms dictated to it. We cannot always put ourselves into someone's shoes, as we are asked to, and take into account someone's concerns, while our own interests and concerns are not taken into account. And this applies not just to the US, it applies to any partner who would like to cooperate with us. The situation around the conventional forces in Europe treaty showed that the European security architecture and its elements are becoming unsustainable, since they're no longer based on the principle of equal security. And this situation is fraught with the risks that Russia will have no other choice but to opt out of those structures and to start cooperating with them, including with NATO, on the ad hoc basis, and to commercialize this cooperation, applying the well-known American principle of cash and carry. And in this case, our partners will have to decide how to ensure viability of those European security structures on their own, without Russia's participation, if they opt for this variant of action. I think there is only one way to prevent the situation from evolving in this direction, and that is to create an open system of collective security. We put forward relevant proposals how to salvage this European structure at the CFE conference of participating states. We're open to discuss counter proposals. I know that Germans, the French, have some ideas. Americans are moving in the same direction. I welcome this, but we stand ready to interact with NATO in Europe, as well as in other parts of the world, with concurrent involvement of the relevant regional organizations. For instance, it has been over 2 years now that we have been proposing a partnership between NATO and the Collective Security Treaty Organization in respect of Afghanistan, where we don't have any differences at all that Afghanistan must not be allowed to become a nest for terrorists again, that drug problem must be resolved. Unfortunately, there is no response to this offer so far. The era of great geographical discoveries is long gone, and there is no vacuum anywhere that has to be filled. One can essentially conclude that network diplomacy is gaining momentum around the world. This is another direct consequence of the emancipation of international relations after the end of the Cold War. Network diplomacy will inevitably devalue cumbersome and rigid old alliances with fixed obligations to be invoked against already non-existent threats. The US, too, seems to feel uncomfortable about such entanglements. So there can really be one option: to cooperate with anyone who shows interest in cooperation, obviously within the norms of international law and the United Nations Charter. And I'd rather say that sharing becomes the key word. Shared vision, shared analysis, shared burden and shared responsibility, joint decisions and joint action. As a matter of fact, one has hardly any doubts that within a collective leadership of major nations based on those principles, the United States would still be the first, but first among equals. To be such first, one has to recognize, indeed, its partners as equals. As to our strategic relationship bilaterally, I would like to call upon our American partners to proceed from the assumption that Russia does not and cannot harbor any hostile intent against the US or any other power. We simply have no rationale for that. The past ideological one is gone. We are looking to reciprocity in getting rid of ideology which used to feed suspicions and hostility. In any event, there is no strategic or systemic incompatibility between Russia and the United States. In an environment where security and prosperity in the globalizing world are indivisible, we do not see any reason to cling on to narrow interpretation of national interests, including in matters of strategic stability. The proposals by President Putin on missile defense highlight a new realistic interpretation of the issues of strategic stability, that is, abandoning their exclusivity, opening them up to other countries concerned, primarily of Europe, elevating them to an unprecedented degree of confidence. Henry Kissinger understands what kind of opening this creates for a qualitative change for the better in our relations in general, to take them to a new level of strategic allied cooperation, and besides, universalization of strategic area would match the developments in the field of non-proliferation. Unilateral actions undermine trust. I am sure many of you read the views of American professor Ted Postel of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, who admits that current U.S. plans to deploy elements of global missile defense in Eastern Europe will be just a stepping stone for subsequent radical modernization, after which these bases will pose a considerable threat to Russian security. And this is exactly what we have been telling the American side time and time again. We continue our discussions. We offer them cooperation using our radars, which would be able to detect any suspicious moves and would provide enough time to take measures not to allow these fears to materialize. Another danger of unilateral destruction of such a nexus in the area of strategic stability is that in the absence of positive economic interdependence between our countries, such actions can dramatically narrow the very foundations of our bilateral relationship. Unfortunately, unlike the US-Chinese trade and economic cooperation, Russian-American volume of trade and investments looks very modest. Going unilateral will create new problems.